Good evening, and welcome to the UK Forestry webinar series. I'm Billy Thomas, an Extension Forester here in the Department of Forestry. We're broadcasting live tonight from the UK Department of Forestry from the campus here in Lexington. Tonight's webinar is on preventing wildlife damage on your property, and in just a moment I'll introduce Matt Springer, who's going to be giving that presentation. You do have the ability to interact with us via chat pod. In the upper left-hand corner of your screen, there should be a button where you can just click on that. And you put questions in there, and we'll address those questions certainly at the end, if not during the presentation as well. So now I'd like to go ahead and introduce our presenter for tonight. We have Mr. or Dr. Matt Springer. Matt is a wildlife professor, a new professor here in the Department of Forestry. And Matt, we're so delighted to have you with us tonight. Wildlife damage is, something I hear a lot about, but I'm sure, you've already heard a lot about it in your brief time with us.
Yeah, it's something that does come up quite a bit. And, everywhere in Kentucky we have wildlife, and unfortunately, everywhere in Kentucky they seem to cause problems. However, we're going to go over a few ways that you may be able to deal with them in a simple fashion. So,
okay, well, good. Well, Matt's joined us in February of this year, and Matt, again, we're so excited to have you with us. And for some of the folks that haven't had a chance to meet you before, tell us a little bit about your background.
Sure. Originally, I'm from Allentown, Pennsylvania, so the eastern side of Pennsylvania. I did my undergrad at Juniata College in central Pennsylvania. It's a small school. Did my master's on deer damage to winter wheat at the University of Delaware, and immediately my wife and I moved from southern Illinois, where I worked on my dissertation on white-tailed deer and chronic wasting disease spread. Now I'm here and excited to be here.
Well, great. Well, again, we're glad to have you with us, and thank you all for being with us this evening. This webinar is being recorded, so if you want to come back and check it out later, we will have that available on our website. But without any further ado, Matt, I think I'm going to go ahead and turn this presentation over to you. And again, thanks for doing it and being with us tonight.
Okay, sounds good.
All right. Good to go.
All right, let's get into this here. What you're here to learn about, right? So we're going to try to cover a bunch of different topics here, or different tools mostly, of how to prevent or deal with wildlife damage, whether it be at your house, in your yard, or on your farm. There's a couple different options that may help alleviate the issues you're facing. So wildlife in Kentucky. Well, there's hundreds of species of wildlife that call Kentucky their home, whether that be year-round or it might be migrating songbirds. They range in size from frogs all the way up to our big elk that we now have. And dealing with wildlife and having wildlife, it really is important to understand that wildlife is viewed as a public resource and is managed as such. Also to keep in mind is really we are unable to eliminate all wildlife from whether it be your farm, your house, or your yard. There's so many different species that are so adaptable to changing conditions, changing habitats, that it's impossible to keep them away. So there's a couple ways you can go about dealing with wildlife. You can one of the things that we like to say is going to fall under the next slide here is learning to live with wildlife by either altering a few of your lifestyles, but also we may be helping wildlife learn a few new tricks here and getting them to realize that they can't do everything they want to do either. And for an example here, talking about bears and trash, we're so used to just being able to leave trash out. We now have a reestablishing bear population. We may have to make a few changes so we don't have to worry about picking trash up all the time on our front porch. So all of this really falls under this title of wildlife damage management, and it's a philosophy. And what that is really it's an activity that seeks to balance the needs of human activity with the needs of wildlife to hopefully mutually enhance both. We don't want to just either go the extreme of making sure that we're only looking at conserving wildlife species, conserving wildlife habitat. This all falls under the idea that yes, we have to exist together. And with that in mind, we have to realize that sometimes we as humans have to change what we're doing, but also we can change what wildlife want to do as well. It's a balance. We're seeking a balance here. That may mean, understanding that when you plant trees, or you need to make sure that the deer can't get to them for a few years to make sure they survive. But it also means that, we're not inviting deer to come on our porch and eat all the food, our bird food or whatever else that's going on that we're putting out. This entire thing, this concept, this management strategy, the big idea behind it is that we're going to incorporate multiple strategies to accomplish this goal of mutual benefit. This may mean behavior modification, using repellents, excluding wildlife, modifying habitat, relocating wildlife, and then the ultimate worst case scenario is a lethal control method. And in Kentucky, we have a wide range of culprits that we're dealing with on a normal basis, anywhere from white-tailed deer all the way down to voles and mice and skunks and chipmunks. These sites are fairly common throughout the state. I even have snakes up there, and snakes are often viewed negatively, but we're going to kind of talk a little bit about why they shouldn't be necessarily viewed that way, because usually they aren't causing damage unless you're dealing with chicken flocks or egg producers. That's when they are a problem. But one thing you should always keep in mind, there's many species in Kentucky that cause problems, but it could always be worse. So really, when we're looking at using multiple tools to try to deter wildlife from causing problems, we need to make sure, that we are able to identify what wildlife is causing the issue. We just saw that there's a lot of different potential wildlife species that can cause a problem. And with that in mind, there's so many different ways, different descriptions of damage that we really can't get into how to identify all of them. However, what I can do is try to give you ideas on how to narrow it down, what tools you can use to really, on your case-by-case basis, identify what may be causing your issue. So some of the tools that are really helpful, first thing, having a field guide handy, a mammal field guide, a bird field guide, or just plain old using Google or the internet is really a great asset to try to use some of what you're seeing to determine which wildlife species is causing a problem. Other useful things can range in price from buying a trail camera, which there are a lot of inexpensive models now, somewhere around $50 or $60, all the way up to the top of the line models that are $900 to $1,000 a piece. However, for a lot of what are concerns around the house or gardens, those cheaper models will suffice, and they'll last for years. But prior to those technologies coming around, using things simple as placing flour in an area that you think the wildlife are walking through will give you the option of potentially seeing their tracks. And then in combination with that field guide on the internet, you can really determine what species may or may not be causing the issue. It's really important to keep in mind that just because you see a species of wildlife in the area that the problem exists, that species may not actually be the culprit. You really try to take as many pieces of information as possible, put it together, and use that to really narrow down what's causing the problem. We just had a question pop up here about whether or not there's a specific mammal field guide I recommend. Most of the field guides out there, as long as they incorporate a track ID and a slight description of the animals, will suffice. The other thing you can try to look at to help narrow down the potential culprit is, what kind of habitat is around where you're dealing with this problem. The idea being that, hey, if there's no water around the area you're in, a beaver's probably not going to be the one causing the issue. So those bigger habitat field guides, those internet sources that talk a little bit about what kind of habitat do white-tailed deer like, or what kind of habitat do voles like, are going to help you understand, is that habitat present there, and that will help you narrow down the list of potential suspects. Like I mentioned, if there isn't a river or a stream or a pond around, it's most likely not going to be a beaver issue or a muskrat issue. If there's really tall grass and you're seeing a lot of chewing at the ground level, that really raises the potential that it's a rabbit or a vole or a small rodent. So understanding what habitat's available will help you try to narrow it down during your research. Also, what you want to look at is where on the plant or plants did the damage occur. This can really help identify the potential size of the perpetrator. Keep in mind that low on the ground doesn't always mean small mammal or animal. A deer can reach the ground just fine. However, up in a tree, if you have an apple tree, there's only a few certain species that can get to those apples, and generally it's the ones that can climb. So that'll help really narrow that field down. Look at how the plant is damaged. Was it a bite or a tear? Did they mow it to the ground? Did they, was the tree pushed over? Was it rubbed up? Those things will help kind of allude to what animal probably caused the problem. Deer have a certain cut mark where they only have lower incisors. They don't have upper incisors, so their bites are actually at an angle, whereas a rabbit is basically uniformly across. Same with a groundhog. So there's particular characteristics that do lead to you be able to identify those kind of animals. If there's an apple tree that you just planted and it's rubbed up and the bark's removed from top to bottom, it's probably a white-tailed deer, or if you're in southeast Kentucky, it could be an elk that's rubbing it up in the fall. And lastly, IDing like using the flower or looking at areas with mud to identify tracks or even finding scat present in the area is helpful to identify at least what animals are around or using the area, which then can be used to narrow down that suspect list even more. And that's where that field guide comes in handy again. So let's talk a little bit about some of the regulations that really are important to know about if you're wanting to deal with wildlife damage on your property. And the most important one is this Kentucky State Statute 150.170. And this is a Kentucky law allowing any resident to protect themselves or their property against wildlife damage. And basically what this means is that residents are really allowed to kill any wildlife that is immediately damaging their property, as long as that species is not federally protected. Along with that, if you feel threatened by a wildlife species that you feel like you're in danger, it also allows you to protect yourself as well. The only stipulation to this is that you must report any wildlife killed to Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources, a game warden or conservation police officer, if the species is required to be checked for hunting. So that includes your bear, your deer, turkey, or elk. It's a pretty powerful regulation protecting homeowners or landowners. Other important things to consider, we're really not going to talk a whole lot about poisons or poisoning wildlife to control a problem, and that's basically because they're really not recommended in almost any situation. There are some that are legal for use, and if you do choose to use them, you should really think about you really need to follow those label recommendations as close as possible. The problem with poisons are, we put them out there and we don't have complete control over what is consuming them or what consumed them. So there's a lot of problem with what we call non-targets. Those are the species that we do not want to poison getting their hands on the poison itself. Or animals that do eat poison, sometimes while they're dying from that poison will behave differently, such as mice or small mammals will act differently. They won't be in cover as much, and therefore they may get eaten or picked up by hawks or other birds of prey or predators, and that poison sometimes transfers into them and causes those species to actually die. And lastly, we need to talk a little bit about trapping. Trapping wildlife, and specifically relocating wildlife. But when I refer to trapping in this talk, I'm going to really push two things. One, you really only want to target the animal that is causing the issue. And two, you really want to make sure you ensure that those non-target animals or non-target species are not going to be caught. That kind of goes along with poisoning, the same idea where we really don't want it to affect animals that aren't the problem. But trapping in this and in almost all my talks is really, it's the last kind of ditch effort. We don't want to get to that point. We want to cut things off before we recommend this method. So a lot of people, there's a lot of traps out there that are have-a-heart style cage traps that, they really sell themselves on the fact that you can trap the animal and move it away so the problem's solved and you don't have to worry about that animal's health. It will survive and will be fine. Unfortunately, there are some legal ramifications when it comes to that within Kentucky. So certain species like raccoons you're not legally allowed to move them. And that has a direct relation to the fact that raccoons are a rabies carrier. Trap and release of animals that are causing problems, specifically raccoons, is the reason rabies spread across the country so quickly. Trap animals that were, infected were moved 20, 30, 40, 50 miles, and all of a sudden they took the rabies with them. It bounced right along, and now we have rabies across much of the country. Now, other species, you can trap them and release them on private properties with the permission of the landowner. However, it's not legal to release them on public property. In addition to that, one of the reasons why we don't really recommend trapping and releasing animals, from a wildlife biologist standpoint, our professional society does not recommend it, and also now the Humane Society does not recommend it. And there's two big reasons behind that. The first one we've already kind of talked about, disease spread. The second is that as research has come along here, we're really seeing that animals that get trapped and moved to an area aren't really, they don't have a high success rate of survival. And that has a lot to do with two different things. One, the animals are unfamiliar with the area they're moved to. Therefore, they have to relearn it. Find where the food is, find where the cover is, and while they're doing that, they're exposed much more than they normally would be to other predators. Also, you're taking an animal out of a system there where it's socially, the social structure is pretty settled, and you're moving it into another area. So if you would take a raccoon from one area where it pretty much the dominant structure is set up, and move it 20 miles away into an area that has other raccoons, those other raccoons are going to fight that raccoon to get their social structure back in order. And during those fights, it's often that the animals are injured, not only just the animal that was moved, but also the animals that were present in the site. So it actually reduces the survival of both individuals or multiple individuals. And that's why the Humane Society really does not recommend trapping and relocating wildlife. So let's talk about some of the strategies that fall under this wildlife damage management and how to deal with wildlife damage. There's a couple basic guidelines for dealing with nuisance wildlife. The first is really to ask yourself, is this really a problem? Having a rabbit come in and eat 2 or 3 tomatoes every now and then, or a squirrel come down and grab a couple tomatoes off your plants, is that really a problem? Can you deal with that loss of tomatoes? Do you need to have every tomato? In some situations it may not be a problem, but in a lot of situations it can be. If you have a deer walk through, if you have strawberries and you're growing strawberries and they walk through and eat every strawberry plant, you're not going to have strawberries. That's somewhat of a problem, especially if you're trying to sell the strawberries. But we always want to make sure we ask ourselves, is this issue really a problem, or is it just something that I can live with? The next question you really need to ask yourself is, can I alter my behavior to solve the problem? And the reason we always say my behavior first is because it's a lot easier to alter your own behavior than it is to try to alter a wild animal's behavior. Can you do something that'll solve the solution, solve the problem on your own end? If you're dealing with bears, one of the big things we talk about being bear aware is, if you're in an area that has bears and you put your trash out 3 or 4 days before it gets picked up, you're raising the likelihood of having an issue. So can you simply just make sure you don't put the trash out to the day it's going to get picked up? That lowers that probability of bears finding the trash and causing a problem. Or if you notice a bear around and you have bird feeders out, you may want to stop feeding the birds for a few days to make sure that bear doesn't recognize that those bird feeders are a food source. The other thing that you can do that's more on the human side of things is, do you have habitat around the problem that you can alter that'll help reduce the risk of the problem? So can you remove a a large hedgerow, or can you mow the grass because the grass is really long? Can you mow the grass around your garden to help lessen the available habitat for rabbits and voles and mice? And then the last thing, on the human end that really, before we get to the trapping part, is can I put some deterrents out to help, keep the animals away for a period of time? And there's two different types of deterrents that we really talk about, and those are a visual deterrent or a chemical deterrent. And there's a couple groups underneath here that we're going to get into. Lastly, as I mentioned, it talked about the ones that alternatives you could use before you get into the ultimate issue or ultimate worst case scenario of trapping. Can you actually trap the animal that's causing the problem or the individuals that are causing the problem? We always want to try to isolate that individual because it may not, you may have 5 or 6 coyotes running your property, but only one of them is getting into the chicken coop. Do you need to remove the rest of those coyotes even though they're not causing a problem? Probably not. And it's a lot more effort to do so. So can you, just trap at the chicken coop to get rid of that animal that's getting in there and solving that problem in general? And then lastly, like I said, is poisoning really necessary? Can you eliminate the problem before getting to that level of issue? And through all of this, the most important thing to really understand is this is going to be a long-term battle no matter what. You're not going to be able to really eliminate the issue in one day or one year, because wildlife are everywhere, and even if you remove a raccoon this year, you're probably going to have another nuisance raccoon down the line. One of the questions that popped up here is, what are you supposed to do with the trapped animals? Unfortunately, really, why I keep saying trapping is really a worst case scenario and a last ditch effort is our recommendation is if you're willing to trap the animal, you also have to be willing to humanely put the animal down. We don't want to move that animal around. We don't, that's unfortunately where we stand. You can try to catch the animal and haze it. That, you may be able to do that. However, the protocol that we issue here is that if you have to trap the animal, you have to also be ready to humanely put the animal down. So some examples of habitat modification. When we look into what habitat's preferred, say you have a rabbit problem or a vole problem, well, simply knowing that, hey, I have some apple trees and the voles are chewing on the roots of my trees or the bark of at the base of my tree, and it's causing the tree to become damaged. Well, voles don't really choose areas that don't have long grass because it's a risk to them to getting eaten. So if you mow the grass on a really regular basis, it helps lower that risk of the voles being around. Or, hey, I have rabbits around, or I have groundhogs around, and I have a big pile of limbs and debris immediately next to my garden. Well, that's habitat for them to hide in, so they only have to go 10 feet to get to the buffet. So moving that from the area really may change how their behavior is in terms of dealing with that risk of walking to the garden. So those little things can go a long way in terms of dealing with smaller scale problems. Or even when you get into orchards, voles are a big issue at large scale orchards. So getting rid of that long grass can pay big dividends in the long run for those orchards. So when we get into deterrents and scare devices, there's a lot of different options, and a lot of different options for many different species. Unfortunately, there's no silver bullet. Their effectiveness really varies by the species and how long you'd like them to be effective. Over time, their effectiveness lessens, and that has a lot to do with the fact that animals become habituated to these devices. They know that, these devices will not cause them harm. They'll figure that out over time. However, you can do a few little things that'll help lengthen that time period they're effective. You can move the device around, change its, if it's a propane cannon, you can change the frequency at which it shoots off, that explosion. You can move the balloons around, move the scarecrows around. You can, so there's coyote, so give me an example, there's a coyote decoy that they use a lot for nuisance geese and in parks. If you move that from one side of the pond to another, or just halfway closer to the pond, further away from the pond, those things will help lengthen that time it's effective. Adding multiple different types of deterrents at once will help you change the amount of time that they're effective. But really, as I mentioned, there's no silver bullet. So you have to, their use is very much, if you have a period of time where your garden, you have certain vegetable in your garden or fruit that's coming ripe, and you want to protect it right at that point in time for 2 or 3 weeks just to buy you some time to get it harvested, that's a really good time when these will work. They'll buy you that week, that 2 week period to get that vegetable and fruit finished. A lot of times what these animals are after, especially in gardens, is that ripe fruit just like we want. So they may not eat it up to a certain point in time. So protecting it over that two week period can be very important and really help you deal with your problem. A lot of the visual repellents are effective in the short term, especially, but these are the ones that are really moving them around will definitely buy you more time as opposed to some of the chemical ones. Examples of these are balloons, owl decoys, snake decoys, coyote decoys. You have your silver flashing pans and streamers. Most of these are really, they're geared a lot towards birds, and they are more effective on birds, whether that be crows or starlings or blackbirds. They respond better to these than say mammals. Mammals will figure out quite quickly that these deterrents are not going to harm them. The exception to that may be the picture there at the bottom, the gator heads. But even those are really geared towards geese and herons. Now, there's a different group here that wasn't really mentioned previously, and that's the auditory one. And really, that comes down to two different types of devices. The one that I mentioned, the propane cannon, and then also there's you can buy distress tapes of animals sounding like they're in distress. These really work well on birds, especially roosting birds. Setting up a propane cannon near a roost, having that propane cannon go off right when the birds are trying to roost is effective, and it will help the birds relocate to another location, especially done over several days. It also works around planting time to help make sure that the birds don't eat the seeds that you just put in the ground, allowing a little bit more time to germinate. Distress tapes are hit or miss. They can be effective, but generally over a much shorter period of time. And unfortunately, they sometimes will only work a day or less. We have tactile repellent, also very much geared towards birds and bird roosts or bird nesting. The idea behind this is it's a sticky, gooey substance that the birds will not want to step on or land on, and therefore, if there's no perch for them to land on, the idea being that they will relocate to an area that has those perches that are suitable for their activities. The downside to these they are sticky. They generally are designed not to cause damage to the material they're put on. However, you do have to reapply them on a fairly frequent basis because that stickiness will dry out, and therefore once it dries out, the birds won't be deterred as well. Now, the other larger group that exists and this is really geared a lot more towards mammals than birds, is chemical repellents. And a lot of times these are designed to be an adverse taste so that the animals don't like what they're tasting, and therefore they'll stop eating the plants. Most of them are designed to not damage the plants they're placed on. Really, they don't stop damage entirely. They generally will slow or limit the amount of damage that's occurring. So the animal has to take a bite of the plant just to realize there's something on there that they don't like. And if they're like most of us, one bite doesn't really teach us a lesson. That might have just been one bad bite, so they're going to take another bite. So it may take a little bit of time for the animals to learn that this doesn't taste good. They do make a couple different varieties for Some states have them approved. Unfortunately, Kentucky does not have the one. I can't think of it right now, but placing it on seed when it's planted, sweet corn seed or things like that, it will help deter blackbirds from eating it, seagulls from eating it. We do have some that can be used on soybeans or gardens. It's safe for consumption, and that's the Hinder product there. It's the third picture over from the left. That one contains capsaicin, so hot peppers basically. And the idea behind that is, it's an adverse taste. We can consume it. It generally wears off in a few weeks. You can place it on vegetable gardens, on landscaping, on row crops. However, it's quite expensive. And unfortunately, just like there's variation in humans where some of us like hot sauce, there's a lot of mammals that are the same way, where some individuals don't like hot sauce and others are pour it on. So it can be mixed results. Some other things that may work on the chemical end, smell aversion. So there's chemicals that you can place out there that'll especially mammals, since birds don't generally have a strong sense of smell, but mammals do. These chemical repellents kind of elicit that fear response where something smells bad. Or smells like danger, I shouldn't be around it. However, like all the other deterrents, the animals will put 2 and 2 together. If there's no true negative response associated other than smell, they'll start, getting closer and closer to that food item. They're going to want to consume it, especially if it's the winter and they're hungry. There's a lot of homemade remedies as well, and these kind of go off that smell response mostly. Some of them, include soap, ivory soap, human hair, animal urine. Some folks will put out coyote urine, wolf urine, red peppers. There's no true scientific evidence behind this being more effective than any other deterrent, or effective at all in some cases. However, these really get to the same factor why they may or may not be effective is it's something different, new to the animal in the environment. They don't necessarily know how to respond to it, and therefore they're going to be wary of it. So it will probably buy a few days, a few weeks, but in the long run, it's not a end-all, be-all. So outside of deterrence, the next big way of preventing damage, and one of the more reliable methods, however more costly, is the use of exclosures. And these are a really good idea, especially if you have something you want to protect over a long term, whether that be a garden, tree planting, or a new landscaping where you want to make sure that the plants get established. There's a couple different types of exclosures, and they're geared towards what are you trying to keep out. So we're going to kind of go through what groups of animals you want to keep out. So for birds, we're looking at mostly our big culprits here are blackbirds, cardinals, and some other small birds, and really they're trying to get at berries a lot of times. So what we want to look at is using of nets to place over the berries, making sure that they're secure and tight, that there's no way that the animals can get in at any point, because if they can find their way, or if there is a way in, they're going to find their way in. It's incredibly effective at protecting berries, also newly planted seeds. Generally, it's not that costly. You'll get a few years of use out of it. However, you may run into some issues with holes in the long run. So when you do this in combination with other things that you can use as deterrents, it really increases that effectiveness over time. Especially when you're dealing with berries and these smaller birds, the fake snakes in and around your berries will help a lot. The fake snakes by themselves are not as effective, so when you put them in combination with each other, it really will help protect stop a lot of your problems. Our next group of animals are rodents, and in this group we'll have voles, moles, chipmunks, mice, and rats. They can cause damage to crops and trees during planting and any time after. Because of their size and their ability to fit through small areas and climb, Exclusion is much tougher. So, you know, unfortunately, this group, trapping is really probably the best option. And if you have a real big problem with these animals, whether it be voles and your garden, you may want to start a lot of your plants inside to help avoid seed loss and also give the plants an edge in terms of a head start. Small or, you know, snap traps and small cage traps are incredibly effective at catching these guys. You want to target the trapping around the areas that you're having the issue. And when you're dealing with voles and mice, you want to target the holes that they're using. The other thing to keep in mind with these guys, outside of you personally trapping, is understanding the potential role of biocontrol. And what biocontrol is allowing natural predators to really help keep these populations in check. That means encouraging the presence of owls, coyotes, and snakes in the areas that you're having issues. And that also includes hawks and kestrels and birds of prey in general. Those guys are incredibly effective at catching these animals over the long term. They're working for free for you. Simple things like putting a perch, a pole up near your garden that the birds can land on to use to hunt is an easy way to help encourage these guys being around. So unfortunately, excluding these guys is basically impossible. So trapping is really the only method to help reduce them without using poisons. Other smaller mammals, slightly bigger than rodents, include your raccoons, squirrels, rabbits, skunks, possums. And these guys, short fencing and or netting will kind of deter them from getting into your gardens or other places. Unfortunately, the exception to that are raccoons. Raccoons are very good at climbing. So you may need to potentially use an electric fence if you really have something you want to protect from them. Smaller the holes in the fencing, the better. A lot of these guys have very dexterous hands and can reach through fencing if it's big enough to get to plants. That specifically would be the raccoons, squirrels, and possums. In addition, these guys are good burrowers, so you may need to install the fence about 6 inches into the ground and then turn it out away from what you're trying to protect so they can't get underneath it and burrow underneath it. One of the simple solutions to that, if you have gardens in your backyard, is those raised bed gardens are kind of a good natural way, or, well, cultural way of keeping those animals from burrowing into them. So if you really want to protect yourself here from the small mammals and birds, you can see there the picture on the right has kind of the full setup there from a raised bed garden with a small fence in the bottom and some netting on top. When you get into the raccoons, if you don't want to run the electric route, raccoons are fairly easily trapped in cage traps. And, you know, targeting an animal that's specifically getting into your garden is as simple as putting the cage trap in your garden itself. So you may need to resort to that level if you can't solve your problem with the exclusions. Now, there are larger intruders, and really that's three big ones and a slightly smaller one. That's our deer, our elk, for those of you that are down southeast. Bears, also in southeast Kentucky, but slowly moving its way into other parts of Kentucky, and then coyotes. Deer, elk, and coyote can all kind of be excluded by using an 8-foot fence. If you're going to go this route, to make sure you exclude coyotes, you should run, coyotes are very good at digging, like most dogs. So you'd also want to run about 6 inches into the ground and fence into the ground and turn it out. Unfortunately, an 8-foot fence works really well for those guys, but when you get into bears, they're also very good at climbing, or they can potentially just knock them over if you're running a plastic one. So the ultimate control for all of these guys is using electric. Electric fence will keep them all out. You just have to adjust the wattage on the line and the power of the volts on the line. High enough voltage will make sure that none of these guys are a problem. To give you a visual of some of these exclusion methods for these guys, for this size animal, on the top left there, we have just an 8-foot plastic fence. This is really effective for deer, can be effective for elk. Unfortunately, with the plastic, it also is maybe not sturdy enough to keep them out if they're really motivated to get in there, especially if you're dealing with a bull elk. There's 2 different electric designs that can be used. The one in the top right there is a very standard electrical fence design with 2 lines that go about 28, 30 inches off the ground. Is the top line, and you have another line underneath. In these designs, a lot of times what you're going to do is try to train the animal about that the electric fence is there. So you may put aluminum foil on the fence and put some peanut butter on it to encourage the animal to come up and take a lick, and then thus the animal gets zapped and learns that there's a negative result in being around that fence. That will work a lot of times with these guys. However, it's not as effective as the other design. The other design actually uses 2 different fences in an offset method. So you have a much taller interior fence with a slightly shorter outside fence that it has about a 2.5 to 3 foot gap in between. Both of these fences are electrified. They can be run on solar power, or if you have the ability to plug them in, that's also an option. But the reason that they're offset is that what it does when you have you don't need an 8-foot fence for this to be effective, because what you're doing is you're putting a hot wire at any level the animal may put its nose. So it may try to climb, go under the wire itself and it'll get zapped, or it may try to walk up to the wire and walk through it and it'll get zapped. But the offset design basically allows, it plays on their eyesight where they can't really tell how far the fence is away, and therefore they're really not likely to try to jump over it. So it's a really somewhat tricky method that plays on the fact that they don't really have great depth perception. This style fence is very, very, very effective. So if you have an area that you absolutely want to protect, that you've invested a lot of money in tree plantings, this is the style fence that you'd want to put up, especially if you have a lot of deer around or elk around that can easily, destroy that entire planting in one night. To give you an example, there's a wildlife biologist down in southeast Kentucky who's an elk biologist who his family runs a vegetable farm on the side, and this is what they use. This is the design they use to protect their crops from wildlife, and they have had no problems whatsoever. So to get a little bit more into the forestry side of things, because we are in the Department of Forestry here, I want to make sure I touched a little bit on tree and shrub plantings. This is particular interest in landscaping. Also, if you start a tree farm, your big concerns here in terms of wildlife are your deer, your elk, your rabbits, and your voles. These animals will go after and try to eat varying parts of the plants. The rabbits and the voles will be trying to attack either the root system or the base of the trees or shrubs, whereas the deer and elk will most likely start from any plants they can get at above leaves, stems, or the buds. So you can do a couple different things. You don't necessarily have to go the full large-scale exclosures. You can use something like a tree guard shown on the left there, which will help protect the plant long enough to help it get established and survive, because these trees and plants really are able to deal with some level of browsing from wildlife, but it's when they're newly planted, they're not established, they're somewhat vulnerable as is without other insult to injury, that we want to make sure we try to lower that likelihood of the trees getting one more damage on top of being relocated. Another solution, which if you are in a high density area of deer, especially in the fall, fences placed around these trees, since your male deer or male elk may try to use them to rub their antlers on as a signal during the rut for those guys. So those metal fences will help prevent that from occurring as well, because that rubbing from those animals can damage the bark or also potentially break the tree outright. The big things here, as we're kind of coming around to wrapping up, is the take-home messages that I really want to make sure that you get are: understand that this is a long-term battle. You're going to have wildlife present every year. Your species may change, but they're always going to be around. You may have different problems year in, year out. But, you know, this is not going to go away in one day. And you have to really make sure that you understand that. Other things, you know, we talked about a bunch of different tools and options to use. Having a strategy that really incorporates different tools is going to be for the better. Throwing a bunch of different methods at these wildlife, kind of keeping them on their toes, is going to work out better than just having a balloon in your yard and saying, oh, that kind of worked for a little while. Have a balloon, have a scarecrow, play a distress tape. Those will all really help limit the likelihood of the animals figuring it out on a quicker basis. Other things is you want to be realistic about your outcomes. Because wildlife are around and will always be around, you're not going to be able to eliminate all wildlife and all wildlife damage. But trying to keep it where it's not really causing a problem. So say you have, you know, a garden in your backyard, making it so that you only have a squirrel that's getting in there versus a squirrel, a rabbit, a skunk, a possum, and a deer is a lot better. So you can limit your issues a lot easier than you can eliminate them. And, you know, I'm always going to plug this here is remember that having native predators around is not necessarily a bad thing. You may be worried about seeing a coyote in your yard or a fox in your yard, but having them around may help them control other things that you're already dealing with, like your voles or your moles that are digging up your lawn. Or, you know, having a snake in your garden is probably helping you keep mice from chewing your tomatoes or squirrels from chewing your tomatoes. Having them around helps you in the long run. You know, obviously they can pose their own issues, coyotes and foxes in chicken coops. However, if you're not having an issue on that level and they're around, you're probably better off trying to keep them around. And with that, I want to make sure I point out a couple different resources that are available to you. There's a nuisance wildlife control website found that has a bunch of different options, articles talking about different methods that may help you out. And then there's also the Internet Center for Wildlife Damage Management. This website has a scat key. So if you find a pile of scat, it has a way of keying that out to find which animal is causing the problem. It also has other resources about dealing with various wildlife species. And with that, I also want to point out there's my contact information, my email, my phone number. Our website is listed, and a Facebook page that just started as well. And if you are experiencing wildlife issues, make sure you go to your county agent, see if they can help you out, point you in the right direction. And if they're having problems, they're more than welcome to contact me.
Well, Matt, thank you so much. It was a good presentation. I know that we'll pause here for a second, let folks ask any questions using the chat pod if they will. I had a question that I was thinking about. Where do you find some of these repellents? Can we get those basically anywhere? Do we have to mail order them? Or?
So some of the repellents you can actually go in. Walmart will sell those balloons that have the eyes on them. The coyote decoys, you can, you know, Cabela's will sell them as hunting tools, but, you know, there's no difference between a Cabela's hunting coyote decoy than there is a coyote decoy to keep geese out of your yard. So those options exist, and then there's also you can go in terms of the urines. If you want to try the urine route to keep animals out, you can try to go to Trapper Supply warehouses or Google a Trapper Supply. They sell a lot of the urines that are associated with predators that may help you with that end of things. Also, some of them, if you also Google nuisance wildlife strategies, generally there's a couple dealers that have a couple options.
Okay, well, excellent. It's amazing that it's much more complex, I think, than I really thought. You know, it's just a matter of not just like physically removing that animal. There's a lot to think about and a lot to consider, and really knowing what you're dealing with is so important, you know.
I'm going to put you on the spot because earlier this year when I just started, I think you had to borrow one of my trail cams to figure out what was causing problems in your garden. It was your dogs rather than the squirrels you thought was.
It was. I did. I thought we were having some squirrel issues, but my golden retriever was it was getting in there a little bit. So, you know, it's maybe not all what you think. So, folks, please take this opportunity to enter questions into the chat pod while we have Dr. Springer here with us, and it looks like
we have a question about how effective are effigies. I guess my question, or I have a question back to that, is for what species are you worried about?
So we'll let that get in there. And there was do you have a list of animals that are federally protected?
Blackbirds. Effigies for keeping blackbirds away. I have not. I will have to look into this. Unfortunately, I have not had that question come up yet. And I'm not aware of the answer to that, so I'll have to do some research into that. Okay. If you can let your county agent know to touch base with me, I will get the information to that agent to answer that question. Effigies are incredibly effective on other bird species like vultures, but they're also used sometimes on coyotes, but they're not effective on. So it's really a case-by-case basis, and without being asked that question before and not hearing about it before, I don't want to give you the wrong answer.
No, that's good.
The question before that about a list of animals that are federally protected. One of the best ways, if you're having an issue, contact your local private lands biologist and ask them if the species is protected. All of your songbird species and migratory bird species are protected. And the only ones that are not are the species that are allowed to be hunted during hunting season. So if you have a goose problem in July, you're still not allowed to use that 150, 170 reg on those geese. You have to go the route of getting a permit from the state for those guys.
I would say would the same thing apply to like hawks as well?
Hawks are also federally protected. Your raptor species, your owls, they're all federally protected. Okay. So there's most of your mammals are not. Okay. There is not a mammal in Kentucky that's federally protected. Okay. So it's basically your migratory birds that are really protected. Okay. And I'm trying to think about herps, and I don't think of it. There's none that are coming to my mind off that. So your amphibians and reptiles, I can't think of any there. So it's really your bird species.
Yeah. So, but like you said, if you're in doubt, maybe check with your private lands biologist with the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources. They're also a resource to come out and help you kind of manage your property for wildlife. And I'm sure they probably deal with some wildlife damage issues as well. They
are the ones, if you're having some extreme damage issues, especially with deer or elk or geese, they're the ones you want to contact. They can issue you permits to help you deal with that damage. They have a structured in place to assign permits and a plan and how to give those out. So if you're worried about row crop agriculture and have deer damage, you want to contact your local private lands biologist to go that route.
Well, we just saw another question pop up talking about hogs. And, and Matt, remember back in the summer, we had a woodland owner short course up in Henry County. And we had Chris Grash, who is a private lands biologist with the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources. And they was up there talking a little bit about hogs. But are they protected? Do they have some protected status?
Wild hogs do not have a protection. So you guys found the mistake I made there, because I'm coming from an area we didn't have hogs, so I constantly forget we don't have hogs. And unfortunately, we have hogs, and I believe we're down to 5 different areas in the state where we have wild hogs present or feral hogs. We do not want them around. They're not federally protected. Unfortunately, with the way wild hogs work, feral hogs work, it may not necessarily be a good thing to shoot into the hogs. So the best thing to do is actually contact the Fish and Wildlife biologist, Kentucky Fish and Wildlife biologist. His name's John Hass, and he's the one in charge of that. And they will come out and try to trap hogs in your property if you're having hog issues, with the goal being that they catch all of the hogs at once. Because if you end up shooting into a sounder of hogs, which is a group of hogs, you may get one, but what actually happens then is that sounder can break up, and those different little groups of wild hogs will go in 3 or 4 different areas, and they'll get established there. And now all of a sudden you have 3 or 4 groups of wild hogs instead of just one.
Kind of like invasive species.
Very much so, yeah. So keep moving. So we always recommend trying to trap the hogs. However, if you only have one wild hog on your property, please, by all means, get rid of it. We do not want them to get established.
Yeah. I had a chance to see some of the damage that these critters can do, and it is amazing how much damage they can do. So certainly if you've seen anything like that, get a hold of your private lands biologist and try to get that problem before it gets much bigger.
Absolutely.
Well, folks, we'll stick around for as long as you have questions, but please get them to the chat pod if you would. If you are at a county extension office, please get those questions to your agent. I will also ask, if you are at an extension office, to complete the evaluation before you leave tonight. And so, Matt, while we're waiting for maybe any final questions, kind of, one thing I wanted to mention to the folks, and if you said it earlier and I missed it, I'm sorry, but I know you've been in the process of updating a lot of our older wildlife damage fact sheets and information, and we've got a kind of new section on our website that's trying to highlight some of that. So
Dr. Barnes, the predecessor there, he had put out several publications on multiple species back in the late 80s, early 90s, and there's several. A lot of the species are covered. However, some of that information is now out of date. Right. So I'm trying to get to it and update it. There's new regulations. We now have a couple new species since he wrote those that are present in the state now, with elk, which are reintroduced, and then bears, which are now growing in population. But all those will be updated, and then as part of my position, I'm trying to wrap together a wildlife damage website, which will have each species that I get reports on and have a publication for that I'm dealing with damage will have a website dedicated to that species.
Oh, wow.
Talk about the information on how to deal with that problem. The ultimate goal is to get videos and pictures up how to set traps or how to modify habitat to help you deal with that problem, so you get that visual side of things. And that can all be found right now. I think we have a couple species up with beavers and muskrats and white-tailed deer. We just got black vulture up. We just had black vulture publication come through. That's up and can be found on the extension side of the Department of Forestry website. If you go to the wildlife page, and there's a wildlife damage page there.
Excellent. So, folks, again, looks like another question on possums this time now.
Yeah. So we have a possum eating cat food. Circumstances do not allow exclusion or moving where the food is placed. Ideas. Is it possible to only feed the cat during the day and only put the food out during the day? Because possums really are more of a nocturnal animal. Is it possible to maybe bring the food in at night to get that animal away from eating that food? Animals are a creature of habit. So if you have food out every day, they're going to come back to it. So if that food's missing for a week or two, they'll stop coming back looking for it, and they won't be there as frequently. Unfortunately, if you excluding them, I'm guessing it's an outdoor cat, so it's unfortunately you have one of two routes where if you can either limit that food availability, or unfortunately you have to remove that animal from trouble. Now, possums, if you can deal with the fact that the possum is eating the food, do not carry any diseases that would cause any issues with your cat. So if you can deal with feeding the possum and the cat, maybe not necessarily a problem.
Well, what about like the coyote decoys you saw? It'd probably be a temporary at best.
Yeah, and unfortunately, possums aren't necessarily the smartest of individuals. A lot of times we can walk right up to them. Okay. So that there's no real deterrence there that would necessarily work on those guys. So they're.
It looks like we're up in Boyd County with that question there. So. Well, again, folks, please use this opportunity to get some questions in. And, I will encourage you to check out our website, www.ukforestry.org. And from there, you can find some of Matt's also contact information, as well as these publications that you do have up there, and find out if you do have other questions, how to get a hold of us. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank Renee Williams, who's behind the scenes doing the production for this show. Renee does a great job of making these things go off pretty much without a hitch. So thanks, Renee. And also thanks to our county extension agents who are serving as hosts out there. And most of all, thank to you all for being with us this evening. I hope you got as much out of it as we did. And please check out our website if you've got any more questions, and we'll be happy to try to take those. But if there's no more questions, we're going to go ahead and wrap this webinar up for tonight. So Matt, thanks again. Welcome aboard. So glad to have you here on the UK Forestry Extension team, and just really excited you're with us.
Happy to be here. Right. I'm hoping some people got something out of this.
Yeah, I'm sure they did. So, again, this thing is recorded, so we'll have it posted here in the next couple of days, and you can get that off of our website as well. So, again, thank you all very much, and please have safe travels.